Hello everyone, and thank you for stopping by my channel once again. Here I have two clear stamp sets. One is named brunch and the other is coffee, and these are both by Stampability. These are $2.99 at Hobby Lobby. And when I saw them, I thought they were so cute, and I wanted to combine these two stamp sets to make cards. So I'm actually going to be making 7 cards using each sentiment in these two sets. So let's jump right in. So I went ahead and off camera, I stamped a bunch of these in watercolor paper and colored them with my Arteza paintbrush markers. And I just did some light shading with two lighter and a darker shade on that Arteza set. And I did that to eliminate some time as I'm doing 7 cards, and coloring does take time. So I did this when my son was asleep. So, anyways, I'm using cardstock that I bought from Hobby Lobby. It doesn't say what the I guess poundage or whatever, how heavy it is, but it's a standard cardstock. So I thought it was pretty sturdy. So starting off with my first card, I am using this pattern paper here with these black little circles. They almost remind me of like coffee cup stains. And I am going to use my pencil and outline the card paper and cut that down to the size. And then I'm going to be using my tape adhesive and laying that down on my card. Next, I'm going to use this watercolor paper and I'm going to cut that smaller than the pattern paper. So I want the pattern paper in the back to actually show a little bit more. So I'm using my ruler here to figure out exactly how much smaller I want that panel to be. So I draw the lines and then I end up cutting that to the proper size. And once I cut that down, I'm going to be using Tattered Rose Distress ink, and I'm going to be blending that in the center. And I'm just going to blend it till I am satisfied with the color. Next, I'm going to just um, splatter some water and then remove the excess water with a towel. And then it gives me that um, water effect. Next, I'm coming in with the distressed ink in color tea dye, and it's not necessarily like a coffee color, but it gives it like enough of a stained look, which I like. And I'm focusing this on the outer edges going inward. And then once I'm satisfied with that color, I come in with the distress ink in gathered twigs and try to do a little bit of a darker blending all around the edges where I blended tea dye. Once I am done, I'm going to go ahead and put that um, in the center. Actually, I was going to put it in the center, and then I decided that I wanted this to be a little bit more pleasing to the eye and add interest, so I did it towards like an angle. Next, I have the coffee cup and the coffee mug, and I want the coffee cup that has the heart to actually look like it has um, the what is it? The little it's like cardstock paper around the coffee cup, and I had this type of paper in one of my cardstock packets that I had bought. So I end up stamping it with the gathered twigs ink, and then I just cut it off and then glue it down with some glue. Next, I'm bringing them to the front panel here, both my coffee cup and my coffee mug. And once I am seeing where I want them to be placed, I grab my sentiment from the stem set, and I use the black archival ink and stamp that down. Um, and the sentiment reads, "Thanks a latte." And then I decided I want a little bit of a pop of color, so I grabbed the stamp set, Showers and Flowers from the Simon Says Stamp March card kit. So it comes with the smaller heart and the larger one, and I use my archival ink and Vermilion, I think that's the name. I don't remember. And I'll link it down on the description bar. And I just stamped 3 hearts, and I thought that gave it a nice pop of color. And then to add a little bit of more interest, I wanted to ground the coffee cup and mug. So I use spruced ice distress ink with a little bit of water and put that down underneath the coffee. So card number 2, I thought the camera was recording and I actually forgot to press record. So I didn't miss too much luckily. So what I did is I cut down this cardstock paper to the size I wanted to fit the front of the card. And I used distress ink, gathered twigs, and inked up the edges just to give it a darker look. Next, I grabbed the coffee bean stamp, and I'm using the Ranger clear embossing ink. And I'm not using any powder, I'm just inking it up just to make my own pattern paper here. And I'm using the heat set tool to make sure that the ink doesn't go anywhere. Next, I grab just a random lid I had around to make this circle on this cardstock paper, and I cut that out, and because I cut it out with scissors, it wasn't perfect. So what I end up doing is I grab 2 distress inks, one in tea dye and the other in gathered twigs. I use the tea dye around the circle and gathered twigs on the edges, so that way it gives the illusion that it's a perfect circle. Because I did use the scissors, so I needed something to give it the illusion that it was a good circle. And next I grabbed my paintbrush with a little bit of water and do a little splashes and remove the excess with a towel. Next, I'm using some painter's tape, and I am putting it towards the spine of the card. That way I don't get any ink on the back side of this card. And I'm using gathered twigs, and I am only focusing on the edges here. I really like this combination, like dusty vintage feel. That's why it was so much fun making these cards. So anyways, I adhere everything to the card base here, and I add that circle to the center. And I use some tape adhesive to put everything down. And I grabbed the 2 coffee cups, and the same thing I did with the coffee cup and the first card I did with these 2. And I end up stamping the sentiment, but first coffee, onto vellum paper and use some Gina K white embossing powder, and then add some texture using that same um, rigid craft color paper, and adhere that towards the bottom, add a heart, and then add some jute and make a bowl and add it to the top. Next card, I am using this checkered stencil, and I use some of that painter's tape to make sure everything is in place, so that way when I blend with my blending tool, nothing moves. So I'm using archival ink in black and using my blender tool to make this stencil pattern. And then I went ahead and used some tattered rolls and start buffing it towards the bottom of the area where I stenciled that checkered pattern. And then I use tea dye as well to blend everything. And in my mind, I wanted these little food parts to just kind of float there, but I didn't like it so much. So I ended up going to using this wood paper pattern from the Echo Park. I believe it's the summer 6x6 pad. And I just draw this weird oval shape to kind of resemble a table. And I ink up the edges with spruced ice distress ink. And then I adhere that with some glue. And then I use my microline black pen. I believe this one is a .5 tip. And I sketch these little line swirls at the end to look like the bottom of the table. So it ended up being kind of like a whimsical, I don't know, type of sketch there. So at this point, I'm not really liking how the card is coming out. So I'm kind of just keep going with the flow and see how it ends up. And I wasn't in love with it, but I didn't hate it at the end. So I'm using some small foam tape to pop out certain parts of these little food um, pieces. So I bring forward like the pancakes and the donuts with that foam tape. And then next I grab the wine glasses um, and stamp them down. And I colored them kind of like an orangey color, like a mimosa. And the top part I ended up cutting down and inking that up with archival ink. And then the bottom part I end up blending with an Artisa marker, and I use the Sentiment Let's Do Brunch. Added a little bit of stitching around the shape with my white gel pen, and then I'm using my Nouveau glitter pen to give some shine around the donut. And that completes this card. Next card, I am using two distress inks, no surprise, and distress ink and tea dye and distress ink gathered twigs. And I am going to be blending all around this watercolor paper. Once I blended all around, I'm kind of leaving the center white only because I am going to eventually cut that out. So there's no need to waste ink. So next I apply some of that gathered twigs on the acrylic block, and I do some splashes by adding some water and flicking it with a paintbrush. And then I'm using archival ink in sepia and using that same coffee bean that I used in the previous cards. I went ahead and stamped that all around the card here. And I also use the um, distress ink gathered twigs to darken up the edges of the paper. So once I go all around, again, I'm not focusing in the middle section because I know that I am going to be cutting that section out and I don't want to waste unnecessary ink. Once I'm done here, I use a random lid that I had around that fits the size that I needed, and draw the circle on the center, poke a hole with I don't know what the name of that tool is, but I had it, and I cut that around. And then I grab my Distress ink, gathered twigs again, and blend the edges of the inner part of that circle I cut out. And it just gives the illusion that it's a perfect circle. So now I'm going around the card with the archival ink in sepia and using my blending tool on the actual cream colored cardstock card base to ink up the edges of the card. I just love doing this, especially in these colors. So what I did in the middle of the actual card is I used some of that distressed ink tea dye and added some splotches to make it look like something had spilled over. And then I grabbed some vellum paper and adhere that on top of that so it doesn't look as harsh. Then I grabbed that panel that I had all the coffee beans stamped, and I put some foam tape adhesive, and this is all I had on hand, so that's why they're so small. And I go ahead and place that centered on the card. Next, I grab my 2 coffee mugs that I have left over, that blue and a coral color, and the blue I just use some glue and lay that down, and then on the coral one I use some foam tape adhesive so it gives a little bit of dimension, and I do that for both donuts as well so they pop off the card a bit. Next, I'm working on my sentiment, and the sentiment actually just says coffee over everything. um, and then I use my brown Artisa bright paintbrush pen and brush a little bit of that color on watercolor paper, stamp the sentiment coffee over everything with clear embossing ink, and then I use the Jenna K white embossing powder and then cut that down to the size of the sentiment, and I adhere that towards the top of the card here. And the letters had actually gotten a little bit like some dust or something, like it had removed, so it almost looked dark. And so I went in with my gel pen and just went over the areas that kind of looked dark. And I ground the coffee cups doing the same thing with my gray Artisa pen and that Nouveau glitter pen. The sentiment, let's do brunch, on the inside of the card, just because coffee over everything really wasn't a sentiment for me. And I didn't do this on all the cards, but you can always do a handwritten sentiment inside the cards. And that completes the first part of the 7 cards. And as always, if you enjoyed this video and got inspired, please give this video a thumbs up. And if you have not already subscribed, you can subscribe by clicking my picture. Also, please let me know in the comment section which was your favorite card. And until next time.